in some ways, it actually comes from research where you look at the stats of the client, the normal, pretty typical client contact data. We're surprised, and Moshe Tolman pulled together a lot of this research in his first book, that the most common number of sessions that people have across diagnoses, across severities of presentation, surprisingly, across the world, including and maybe especially developing countries, the most common number of sessions is 1, followed by 2, followed by 3. And we've worked with many different organisations and working with many different types of clients, and it's a very robust finding. For example, a number of years ago, we did a statewide training in single session for community health centres across Victoria, the state of Victoria here in Australia, and we looked at the client contact data before we did any training, and it was over 100,000 clients over 3 years, and the most common number of sessions, which was 42, was 1. Followed by 18%, which was 2, followed by 10%, which was 3. And then it petered off, and there was a long tail.
Yeah.
So that's the first research finding. The second one is that we used to see people who come once, and we plan for it to be ongoing, and they drop out after one session. Yeah. They don't tell us, therapists, and the profession assumed that they were failures, either a failure of the client, not being ready to do the work, not being a good client, or being defensive, or the therapist wasn't good at engaging the person and doing the work. But when we follow up, there's pretty strong evidence that roughly, the majority, roughly 3/4 of those people find that that's actually sufficient from their definition or their perspective for the time, And the therapist may think that the client needs more, but the client themselves decides that given everything, that's sufficient.
Yeah.
And the third research finding is more a clinical finding. Most of our colleagues in the field haven't been able to predict who's going to come once and who's going to come back for multiple times. And so at its most fundamental, the definition of single session that I use anyway, is that if we accept those 3 research findings, then it has clinical implications and it has implications for the organisation or the service delivery, how you're going to deliver those services. And the clinical implications are that you don't know if a person's going to come back or not. So it makes sense to approach that first session as if, and that's important, as if it's going to be the last. Yeah. It may not be, but you won't know. And so that really does change people's clinical work. And it changes it whether, and these stats are relevant for all sorts of models of therapists working in all sorts of models, whether they're family therapists like me, narrative therapists, existential therapists, analytic therapists, cognitive behavioural therapists. Yeah. And so it's relevant to all of those different models. So in some ways, to me, that clearly shows that it's not a particular therapeutic model, or those stats aren't just relevant for a particular therapeutic model. It's relevant for all of them. And what's interesting, and what's a real advantage of this way of working, is that people in the one organisation that are trained in different models of therapy can all work under a single session umbrella and and work in a similar way without having to give up their preferred therapeutic model. Mm-hmm. And that's hugely valuable for organisations that so that you're not arguing and using so much time and effort arguing which model is better. You're saying, okay, well, we'll all work within a single session frame. And it can be really good for, people's motivations and relationships and working relationships. Yeah. In some ways, you deliver your therapeutic approach within a single session framework, and hence it becomes a service delivery model. And what it does is you don't have to give up your model of therapy, but it will influence your model of therapy, and it will influence everyone's model of therapy towards some broad basic concepts, which are the fact, okay, how would you do your favoured therapeutic approach if you knew, or if you thought, or if you treated the first session as if it was the final one that you ever have? And that creates some, general approaches along the lines of, well, I'd ask the client what brings them to the session and therapy, and what would they want to walk away with at the end of the first session, not just for therapy, what they want to get out of therapy, but what would they want to get out of the first session, and what they would want to walk away with. You would check from time to time that you're on track and that they're getting what they want. You would also be more likely to share what you're thinking and your ideas pretty quickly, because, and I use the idea, what would you want to share with your client if you knew that you were never going to see them again? Yeah. So in some ways, people are more, in the single session frame, are more open about their thoughts and their ideas and their feedback or even advice. But it has to be tentative. You can't say, you don't jump to conclusions. Yeah. You have to share, look, I've only just got to know you. We've had one session. I'm starting to get these ideas. How does that fit? Does that make sense to you or not? So in some ways, you're co-creating the hypotheses and the feedback. And that is a very modern way of working now, rather than the expert saying, this is what's happening. It's going, well, this is what I think might be happening. Does that fit your lived experience? Yes? Okay, so you can co-develop and co-evolve that thinking hypothesis. If it's, no, that doesn't fit at all, okay, you've got to stop and start again, or you've got to reorganise your feedback and advice so it actually fits with the client's lived experience. And so that's a very contemporary way of working as a clinician. Well, I think the other element of the service delivery is that, for example, I use an example of a child and family mental health service. In Victoria, when it was established, there was a view that they're dealing with the most complex children or adolescents with mental health problems, that it makes sense to create a very thorough assessment process. And if you get a very thorough assessment process, then you'll be able to provide a very good service. Okay. So many years ago, they developed 4-session assessments. So it was a very comprehensive assessment. And that makes sense, that if you have a very comprehensive assessment, you're going to be able to provide a good service. But the complicated factor is that as a research student of mine found that for a particular service, 34% of those adolescents never made it to the therapy. They dropped out at some point during the assessment. And so all of a sudden, once you find out that data, you feel, well, actually, it's not a great service if 34% of people get a great assessment but no treatment. And another way of doing it is to say, okay, people are likely to drop out after the first session. So the other way is to really give people as much as you can in that first session. And how do you give people the most? The best service in that first session? It's actually asking them what they want. And targeting your response and all your expertise and practical ideas and interventions around what they want, and making sure that they walk away with feeling like they got something from that session. Now that is a very engaging way of providing a service. And the research on client satisfaction with single session therapy approaches is all very high, because you can see why. The client has asked what they want, the therapist is responsive, they check in, they keep asking if this is helpful or not. It's co-evolved. The clinician is open about their thoughts and ideas and feedback and maybe even advice. They get something, and then there's a potential follow-up if they want more help. And I think in the current contemporary world, people, the community, are very well informed. They really want a service when they want it. They don't want to have to wait, and they want a responsive service, and they feel like they should be able to direct or be certainly consulted around the type of service and the focus of the service that they want. So I think that's where single session responds to those community expectations that are only going to grow. The other thing is that those expectations are going to grow at the same time as there's likely to be less public money for health services. And so that creates a huge tension for service systems, for hospitals and health services. They're going to have less public money and have to provide high quality, responsive, accessible services to clients. How do you do that? Well, the single session frame can provide one aspect of addressing that dilemma. Because what we've found too is that if you do provide a responsive service to what clients want and share the knowledge as you get it, and co-evolve that the hypotheses and feedback and advice, then the length of therapy tends to be reduced, but the satisfaction actually goes up. Some people we were working with, for example, nurses or caseworkers, so they're sort of more general managers of clients rather than counsellors, didn't describe themselves as therapists. They were caseworkers or general workers or housing workers or general counsellors. And so when we talked about therapy, they didn't really identify with that terminology. So that's why it was a simple pragmatic change of terms so that they felt more included, and single session work was the term we came upon. But it really shows that, in a way, the single session thinking and principles can be applied to a wide range of practitioners. If it can be applied to any field where a significant number of clients come once and then drop out, and I guess whether they find that one session's helpful or not, if a lot of people drop out after one session and don't come back, it would make sense to make the most of that session. And in a way, that would be making that time, even if the person didn't come back for further sessions, actually more useful and more effective if you're trying to make the most of it by checking out what they want and responding to what they want.
Yeah.
So I think the potential, we focus in the health and welfare area, but I think Moshe Tolman talked about using the ideas with lawyers and a whole range of other service types. So we're not saying that we feel that people should be trying to get everything done in one session rather than more sessions.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't see a single session as a brief therapy. Often it's described as a brief therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Its intention isn't necessarily to be only offer a certain number of sessions. It's to make the most of the first session, and then organisationally not create any impediments to further work if the client wants that, wants further work. And so then it's neither short, as Robert Rosenbaum talks about, it's neither short nor long-term therapy. It's whatever is required therapy, the number of sessions that are required, sort of determined in collaboration with the client. And we tend to find that clients determine how many sessions they'll have. They'll decide with their feet, when they've had enough. You can think of it in terms of just creating a synergy and a transparency around the work that, if it took a long time for us to realise that since Freud, a lot of clients were only coming once, whether we liked it or not. And so rather than what we've done with the single session work is we've responded to what actually is happening, which is that a lot of people come once, and we adapted our delivery of our service to that fact, because it was very hard to encourage people to come longer if they didn't want to. So there's a synergy. Our service, the delivery of our service, actually fits with the natural help seeking patterns of clients. And so it's going to be more efficient because of that synergy. And then the number of sessions usually do reduce, but that's not our goal. It was to provide the best possible service to everyone, people who come 20 times, 5 times, also once. So it's an approach, and I guess it has a particular meaning in Australian culture. Bullshit's quite a common term, and so it's quite an acceptable term, even though it is in the professional context, it's a little bit edgy. But the origins of that is that I love therapy. I decided to make it my career, but it took me many years to realise that not everyone in the community shared my love of therapy, and there are a lot of people in the community who are very suspicious and cynical about therapy and therapists, and so No Bullshit Therapy was to find a way of engaging people who were very reluctant to be engaged in therapy. Also, it was for people who were involuntary or mandated to come to counselling, either partner mandated by their partner or some legal body, some other power wanting them to go to therapy, but they didn't want to. And what we found in trying to work out how best to engage people in that situation in the work was that you almost needed the opposite sort of approaches to what we were taught in counselling to engage them. So, for example, and we've been talking about the single session work around asking, clients, what brought you along here, and what would you like to get out of today, and what would you like to walk away with, and how can I be helpful, and how do you like to work, and how do you actually change, and the therapist adapts and to what the person wants, which is a great way to work, except if the person doesn't want to be there. If the person actually doesn't want to be there, assuming they want to work, and that they want a relationship with you and that they're going to work cooperatively with you is an insult to them.
Yeah.
They don't want to work with you. And if you said, what would you like to walk away with today? They'd probably say, you know, if they were being honest, I'd just like to walk away. That'd be enough. What would you like from today? I'd like you to change my wife and get off my back. So it's actually more helpful to be thinking more in the early stages, to be more upfront and direct about how you like to work.
Yeah.
And people who don't want to be there, you have to be very authentic and very transparent and very clear about the purpose of the work. Otherwise, they get very suspicious very quick. Well, they're already suspicious. It confirms this suspicion of you as manipulative and just trying to psychologize them or get into their world and push them around and control them. So it's being transparent and clear. What's helpful is to say how you like to work, and a way of working with clients like that is I've found that works really well is to say, look, the way I like to work is to be very upfront and direct, and I hope that fits with you. And often I found that people say, that's exactly the way I want to work. I don't want to muck around. And surprisingly, the more upfront and direct you are, the more they can feel trust.
Yeah.
And the more explicit and you are about the rules of the game, if you like, the more that they can feel safe, that they know what you're going to be doing and why. And so, like everyone else, they need to have a sense of safety and trust in the therapist. It's just the way that you get that for someone who's cynical about therapy versus someone who's really likes work, is open to therapy, is very different.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And colloquially, people who are very cynical about therapy, in Australia would be likely to call it it's bullshit. And so hence the name No Bullshit Therapy has hit a chord, and it's been very it's been received very well. I think we been running these workshops for over 12 years, and the first time we publicised it, it was booked out 3 months in advance with waiting lists, because I think workers, especially in working in very difficult areas like the prisons or on the streets or with people who didn't want to go to therapy, had gradually worked that this very direct and upfront way of working was effective, but they often felt that it was unprofessional or not vindicated. And so when they saw this workshop, No Bullshit Therapy, people really found that it responded to a need.
Yeah, I really.
Because if you think about it,
yeah,
if you think about it, most models of therapy and approaches of therapy are designed by people who love therapy, for people who love therapy, and people who don't love therapy are seen as not good at it or not good clients or defensive or disruptive or deficient in some way. Well, what No Bullshit Therapy does is say, well, no, we'll change our approach to fit clients who don't like therapy and make it more palatable and more, simpatico with their way of thinking about seeking help. There's four clinical guidelines, and one is creating a context for a honest and direct working relationships. Mm-hmm. There's marrying honesty and directness with warmth and care and integrating those two. Yeah. There's avoiding jargon. Yeah. And there's making a feature of constraints. Like focusing, rather than trying to avoid difficulties that both you and the client know exist, i.e. they're mandated to come, or they don't want to be there, or they've been using drugs and they think that you're a goody two shoes, or they've something like that, or they've got a family and they're older and you're young and don't have a child, all these things that might get in the way of working. Rather than trying to avoid them or obfuscate around that, sort of make a feature of it and admit to it. I don't have kids. I'm sort of really young. You're probably wondering what the hell I can say about families.
Yeah.
You make a feature of it. You don't obfuscate using jargon. And when there's sensitive issues or difficult issues like violence or drug taking or alcohol abuse, there's all these very sensitive issues. There's a tendency to try and obfuscate, not quite talk about exactly what's happening. And then if you do that, people who are suspicious of counselling become even more suspicious that you're not actually saying what you believe, what you're saying, what you think.
Yeah.
So it's there's a lot more to it than that, but they're simple guidelines.
Yeah.
I don't think they're simplistic, but they're simple, and they take a long time to put into practice. And we have a day's workshop on that. And I did one 2 days ago, and it was received very well. Yeah. Look, I think probably the expansion of the number of books was a result of the international conferences. So the first one that we established in 2012 led to the Michael Hoyt and Moshe Tolman's book from the conference, and then the conference in Banff, our latest one. So, but what's interesting is that although there's the number of books have increased, and there's yours, the areas where single session work is established is still very, very small around the world. For example, Windy Dryden has also published a book, or is in the process of publishing another book in the UK, but it's not established in the UK at all. It's not. Although Moshe Tolman in Israel, I don't think it's established in the service system there. There's only, although Michael Hoyt and Monty Bobel and Arnie Sliver in Texas and California, it's not now. There's not a lot happening in other places in the US. Walk-in services are growing and expanding out of Alberta in Canada, but there's lots of other and also Martin Solokust in Sweden is doing a little bit, but it's not across Sweden. I think it's only where there's a people or an organisation that promotes it that gradually it expands. So to me, that means that there's still a huge potential impact that single session could have in actual, once it's implemented in service, around the world. And we've trained well over 4,500 professionals in single session work in Victoria and in other parts of Australia. And I would have thought that, we'd saturated the market, but the demand just keeps growing.
Yeah.
So I think if you think of America, UK, the work you're doing, it really is still there's huge potential for growth. And I think and the work has been around for, as you say, more than 30 years, and it just takes a long time to actually be implemented. And with implementation science now, we know that new innovations often languish between 15 and 20 years before they're integrated into core practice or implemented into core practice, and then only 10%, if we're lucky, actually ever makes it to core practice. So it is difficult, and there is usually a long lag time. But I think single session is so radical. The idea of maybe that one session will be enough is very challenging to our field and even to the community until they understand it. So it's not surprising that it's taking a long time. And without a lot of support and promotion, it could either just, be a fad and, and fade away, or with the proper support and promotion, it could grow. And I think one of the drivers for it growing will be an economic one that I mentioned earlier, that there's going to be less public money for health services, and yet people are going to demand high quality, accessible, targeted, client-led service. So what do you do?
Yeah.
Well, single session has got something to say about that.
I think so.